Welcome back, Flycorvair. Today's topic, starter motors on Corvair flight engines. Although I've covered this many times in writing and in great detail over 25 years, today I'll cover it visually. Visually is a good way to learn it, and I want to go over this because I recently found out that there's still some people on the periphery of Corvairs who aren't familiar with how the starter motor systems work on Corvairs, their evolution, which engines had them, and why we have them located on the front of the motor where they are today. Let's go over a little bit of history. 1960, Bernard Pietenpol, first man to fly a Corvair. From 1960 until about early 1980s, Bernard Pietenpol was the Corvair guru of the world. All during the time, and I've studied all his work, all during the time, I'm unaware if Bernard Pietenpol ever put an electric starter. All of his motors, I believe, were hand prop motors on his Pietenpol air campers. He used very low compression engines. He used worn engines that were from cars. He used modest ignition timing. These things add up to hand propping motors. And he was good at it. He came from an era of hand propping. However, by the time I was working with Corvairs starting more than 30 years ago, the time had passed where most people knew how to hand prop an airplane. Plus, we were interested in raising the compression ratio, building larger displacement motors, installing them in aircraft that sat lower to the ground, which are much more difficult to hand prop. So from the get-go, I was looking at starter motors. I wasn't the first person to put an electric starter on a Corvair. There had been a few before, but I'm going to say maybe half a dozen in the country, one-off designs that very clever guys had put on. But starting in the early 1990s, I looked at the motor and decided I was going to put the starter motor on the same end of the engine that the propeller was on. The end of the engine that has the starter motor in the car. Now let's review this. Take a moment and look at the photograph of the engine in the car here. The rear bumper is associated with a Corvair always with being near the firewall of the airplane. When you look at a Corvair car, the drive portion of the engine is close to the driver's seat, not the rear bumper. That is where the starter motor and the drive output of the engine are. In this way, they're reversed from VW engines, which are most commonly driven off the wrong end of the crankshaft. But Corvair's always driven off the drive end of the crankshaft. And as we will see, best started off that just like it is in the car. On the other end of the engine is the harmonic balancer, an important component that General Motors put on this, and we'll take a little bit of a closer look at that later. But that is how the engine stacks up. So when you're looking at the propeller end of a Corvair, you are looking at the drive end of the Corvair in the car. When you are looking at the harmonic balancer end, that's the end that was by the rear bumper in the car. So moving forward, in the early 1990s, when it came to putting a starter on the motor, the obvious location is where General Motors put it. Now we have the starter reversed a little bit in the sense that in a Corvair car, the starter's over the differential, and in an airplane it's over the engine. Not a big deal. The driving force of starting the motor, which is considerable, starter motors are very powerful, is applied to the drive end of the engine, where the propeller is. And this makes good sense. We did it this way originally in the early 1990s, and that's pretty much how it was. I only have one exception to this. If you look back at the period of 1996 through 2001, the only airplane I ever built a single rear starter for was, of course, my Pietenpol air camper, and it was the only engine that we ever installed in an airplane, and that's now way more than 20 years ago. Ran that experiment, flew it a couple hundred hours, studied it closely, looked at the entire issue, and came to the conclusion that we were never going to do that again. Mostly driven by KR guys. They got hung up on having the starter on the other end of the engine. Almost no one else was ever bothered by this. But I got to tell you that if you look at it, there are a number of reasons why successful installations are always going to have the starter up on the front by the propeller. And we'll go over the details of that. But I want to point out here that you take a look at an engine, most successful light airplane engine in experimental aviation. Everybody's going to say Rotax 912, but forget that for a minute. Let's take a look at like a Lycoming engine installed in a Vans RV aircraft. Most prolific home builds there are, most prolific engine in home building. Take a good look at it. When you look at a Lycoming, you want to know why people are successful with RVs? Because you can go on the Vans Aircraft Forum and there's not one single joker on there saying, you know what I'm going to do to make the front end more streamlined? I'm going to take the ring gear and the starter motor off the front of the Lycoming. I'm going to move it to the back of Lycomings. There's nothing back there to drive it, but it's kind of a crazy idea, altering the engine to fit the cowling. How about you just get a cowling that works? And we make plenty of cowlings. Originally, the KR guys were trying to fit the Corvair inside a pre-existing VW cowling. And this was a bad idea, and they were willing to mutilate the motor in order to get it to fit inside a pre-existing cowl. You would never catch a guy in the land of RVs doing this. A guy who was saying like, oh, I happen to have a Continental cowling, so I'm going to cut up my Lycoming so that the Lycoming fits inside the Continental cowl. You would just get the right cowl, and that's why those people are successful, because they don't get sidetracked by ideas like that. So this was kind of a major detour in Corvairs, and one that persisted for a long time. But I got to tell you, all the success that we've had, certainly over all the years, is all based on having the starter where General Motors put it and the ring gear force applied to it. And let's take a look at exactly why that is. When you look at the Corvair motor and you look at starter on it, the first thing you have as an advantage to it being on the front of the motor is that the oil system is left relatively intact. If you look at our gold oil systems on motors, you can take a look and see that the oil filter, the oil cooler, and the oil lines are all mounted on the back of the motor. And when you take a look at it, all of that, none of that is on the firewall. None of it has long lines to the firewall. There are not bypasses and all sorts of stuff stuck on the firewall. The oil system is contained on the engine in a very compact form, utilizing our gold oil filter housing, sandwich adapter, and an Series 2800 HD oil cooler. And it's all neatly contained back there. If you move this starter to the back of the motor, one of the things that you can look at is you're going to have to find a different location for the oil filter. You're going to have to find a different location for the oil cooler. Lots of stuff is going to have to be moved around and all connected by long lines and extra fittings and questionable pieces bolted to the firewall. Now, we experimented with all of that stuff, but I want to get people to steer away from that, and we successfully have. So if you look at almost all the Zeniths out there, all the installations that follow our guidelines, all of these engines have the starter up on the front and have a clean oil system on the back of the motor where all the components are on the motor, not spread around the firewall. So, phase one, oil system's a lot cleaner. But the real issue, when you look at it, studying it, is really a question of how much power you're applying to the wrong end of the crank. The rear of the motor in a Corvair has a harmonic balancer. Now let's take a look at a harmonic balancer. Harmonic balancer is a two-piece unit with a rubber isolation ring between it. When the engine goes into harmonic resonance, and all engines have some range of harmonic resonance, when it goes into harmonic resonance, the inner part is turning at crankshaft speed. The outer part leads and lags by maybe a degree or two, moving just ever so slightly. But this dampens vibrations out. This is an important component. Some very low horsepower Corvair engines and short stroke Corvairs did not have them. But all long stroke engines that made more than 95 horsepower all came from the factory with one of these things, and we've installed it on every Corvair engine that we've done. When you take a look at it, this is a vital component that some people with starters on the back of the motor mistakenly remove from the system. This is taking out some of General Motors' best engineering on the engine and just declining to use it so that you can migrate the starter to the back of the motor. So if you look at it, the stub end of the crankshaft is about 1 inch in diameter. on that end where the balancer is mounted, and it has a very small 3/16" standard key that's stuck on there. Now the fit on this to the crank is pretty good, but it's not exactly metal to metal, and it's not shrunk on there. The harmonic balancer is on there snug, and it works to drive the harmonic balancer, and in the car it would drive the fan also. But in an airplane, this is not the location to drive the ring gear from. If you drive the ring gear off of this, not only are you adding a lot of mass that has to be perfectly in balance, but any type of kickback the starter gives you tends to want to shear that key off. This is showing that the keyway right there sticks up just 68 thousandths of an inch. And if it doesn't shear the key off, it elongates the keyway slot in the harmonic balancer or any other device that you bolt on there. Once you get a little bit of slop in there, that no longer turns concentrically. And you'll find a lot of guys who had rear starters got one kickback and then they had a wobble in the ring gear. And very, very shortly later, they had problems with the balancer. There were balancers that came off airplanes as much as 10 years ago. It's overloading the back of the motor. Told people about it, people are generally aware about it. But there were still people who persisted with putting balancers and, starters and built-in alternators on the back of motors. This is not the correct location for it. So you have the difficulties with the oil system, and you also have the difficulties with driving it and not splitting off the mounting system. You look at an electric starter motor and people have no idea how much power and torque those things put into the crankshaft. Any little bit of slop, it's going to open that up. You get a kickback on it, it'll continue to open it up. There have been failures of this system, and granted there were ones that have worked. There are certainly ones that flew over 1,000 hours. But you can go back through the archives and take a look at it, and there have been people who have spit these off the back of the crankshaft and had forced landings because of it. And just recently there's been more problems, but we'll go over that because that's also a crank material issue. So you have the problem with the complex oil system, you have the problem with too much mechanical energy being driven through the tail end of the crank. And keep in mind, if you get the balancer loose on a Corvair or any other piece taking its place of the balancer, the first thing that happens is the little bronze timing gear gets loose on the back of the crank and it moves, and the timing gets instantly altered and the motor turns off. So there's a whole chain of issues on the back of the motor where it's just best left as General Motors designed it. So if you look at it, one of the popular questions people say is, hey, but William, SPA sells a very, very popular rear alternator kit, and I've even seen one on your airplane. This is correct, but if you study the SPA system, none of the mass of the alternator is hanging on the crankshaft. The crankshaft has two rubber drive pins on it that drive the rear alternator. It can't put any bending load into the crankshaft. So the system is remaining intact, and it's only using approximately 1/4 to 1/2 horsepower to drive the alternator in the back of the motor. That's been used for more than 10 years. It has a perfect track record. There's no issue with that at all because it can't put a bending load on the end of the crankshaft, and it's really not driving that little keyway anything in comparison to a starter motor on the back. So there's the mechanical strength issue. Beyond that, there's always guys who say, well, if I had this starter on the back of the motor, I would be able to streamline the cowling so it just went over the top of the motor. I've gone over this to great lengths in writing, but let's take a look at it visually. Visually, if you look at the inlets on the airplane, the inlets have a certain amount of area to the left and to the right of the spinner. That's where all the cooling air is coming in. That has to be the limiting choke point for the engine. all things downstream from there have to have more cross-sectional area than the inlet. All of these guys over the years who say, I want to get the cowling down really low and I want to use a tiny spinner. Well, the two factors that go to work are the blade roots from the propeller hang out in the slipstream and the prop's not very efficient. But the other issue that's more important is what they are blind to is the cooling air between the cowling and the top of the motor. They'll cut it down to a little slot an inch tall. And guess what? That becomes the new restriction to the cowling airflow. Not the inlet area. The inlet area becomes meaningless because they choke the air off across the top of the cylinders. And the air doesn't work very well when it's only an inch above the cylinders anyway. The systems and the cowlings that we have based on the Vans 13-inch spinner that have been around for more than 15 years. These are proven in hundreds of installations. There's no reason for anybody to look at a rear starter because they believe it'll have superior cooling. Just the reverse is likely true. So you can look at all the airplanes, all the original Corvair powered Zeniths, everything that we ever did. You can look at all of our Pete and Pole installations. You can look at all the airplanes that the nose bowl has been fitted on. You can look at Dan Weisman's adaptation of this going on to Sonex-based airframes. All the starters are on the front by the propeller. That's how all of our systems work. Anybody who's looking at putting a starter on the other end of the motor is making a serious tactical error or just sending themselves on an unnecessary wild goose chase where they will have a complicated oil system, where they will have potentially cooling issues, and the most important one is it's the unreliable nature of putting too much mass spinning on the back of the motor with a giant rotating moment of inertia, and also the shock loads of having the starter back there. There are other details about the installation about having the ring gear on the back end of the engine. Now I know this because more than 20 years ago I had one of these on my Pete and Pole. Long before anybody today who's advocating having a starter on the back of the motor knew anything about this, I had years of experience with it. There's some other issues to it. If you have the ring gear on the back of the motor, the ring gear is turning right around an awful lot of wiring. It becomes very difficult to sight the timing marks with the ring gear in the way. On some installations like Sonex aircraft, the fuel filler neck for the fuel tank, a plastic filler neck, is sticking into the engine compartment just above where a rear ring gear would be. So no person in their rational mind puts something that looks like a saw blade turning 3,000 RPM anywhere near the fuel filler neck. Takes no imagination whatsoever to say a guy botches a landing, slides off the end of the runway, puts the airplane on its nose slightly, and just as the engine's coming to a halt, all the fuel arrives in the fuel filler neck by inertia, just in time to have the ring gear on the back of the motor slice the filler neck off and spray it everywhere. So nobody rational puts the ring gear on the back end of a motor, particularly not a Sonex-based airframe. Also, when you take a look at it, one other structural issue related to airframes. Zenith 750s and Zenith Cruisers. If you have a Corvair and you have the ring gear out front, there's tons of room on the back of the motor. However, a 750 and a 750 Cruiser have a design where there are two diagonal tubes in the motor mount. These two diagonal tubes go from the rear corners of the tray up to a central tube at the top of the firewall. This supports the cabin structure. To be structural, these have to be straight as an arrow and rigid. Many people who've thought about putting a Corvair motor on a Zenith 750 or 750 Cruiser haven't looked at this to see that you have to put a bend in those tubes. Now, tubes that have a bend in them in compression have no strength. I can produce a photo from about 8 years ago of an aircraft that had an accident where those tubes broke precisely at the point where they were bent on an installation like this. So all of our installations on Zeniths, 750s, and Cruisers, those tubes are straight as an arrow and they can take an enormous load because they do not have to bow around the ring gear. Now, one last issue. Recently, an aircraft, a Zenith, with a Corvair that had a starter on the back end of it, failed the rear of the crankshaft. Now, it has some of the factors going on of an overload of the end of the crank and being started on the wrong end of the motor. But the important issue is this aircraft did not have an American-made crankshaft in it. The crankshaft in it is a product of China. It is likely cast material. It is certainly not a forged original crankshaft, which can be identified by an 8409 in the forging, and it is not a billet crankshaft like the one available from Sport Performance Aviation. Imported crankshafts that come from communist countries in Asia, like China, have no quality control. This is not a new issue. In the links below, I'm going to show you a story that I wrote nearly 10 years ago explaining why we don't use these crankshafts. The original batch of them that arrived in aviation failed in ground testing. Now, I never imported them, but defunct companies did. The importer is a source in Arizona. The crankshaft that failed recently came from the same guy. So, if you're looking at engines, Corvair engines, and somebody's advocating installing a questionable crankshaft that comes from a source outside the United States, where its material quality is debatable, there'll be all types of people on the internet who say, oh, I think it's stronger, or it's counterweighted, or whatever. They got no experience, and there's a broken crank out there, and it failed materially. And likely, if you put one in your motor, you'll have the same problem too. That's not an emotional statement. What's the definition of insanity is you run the exact same experiment on your airplane that somebody else ran, and you expect a different result. So you want to have a reliable first-class installation on your airplane that's trouble-free? Put the starter motor on the propeller end like I've done for all the installations over all the years I've ever done this, with one single exception that's 20 years old and faded in the rear view mirror. Just enough experience to let me look at it and say, I know what we're doing is right with the motor on the front end. So take a look at these issues carefully. And if somebody comes up to you and says, oh, I heard Corvairs break crankshafts off on the tail end, they're not talking about a General Motors crankshaft, and they're not talking about a motor that had the starter up by the propeller. So if you want to succeed at this game, what you're going to do is you're going to build a clone of something that's successful. If you want to lose at this game, you build a clone of something that didn't work for somebody else, and you hope that it works for you. So keep all this in mind. Take a look at the photographs. If you have any questions, you can certainly call me or write me. Be glad to answer either one. But study the information. Again, this is nothing new. Chinese crankshafts coming into the United States came here a decade ago. They all had a terrible track record. Same supplier, new terrible track record starting. You don't want to be a part of that. People had trouble with starters on the back of the motor eternally. Some worked, some didn't. You don't want to enter into something that some worked and some didn't. Put the starter on the front end of the engine, right by the propeller, where we suggest it goes. Take a look at the simplicity of the engine. Study all this stuff. This video is new, but all the information here is not. We've had a proven way of doing this for a long time. This may be your one shot in aviation to get it right. This is your one chance to make it count. Do you want to get it wrong? Do you want to take a gambler's risk on this? For what? Or do you want to take a look at it and emulate success? Your choice. Your hours, your plane. Your shot in aviation. Give it some careful thought. Thanks very much. If you like content like this, please remember to subscribe. I'm William Wynn, and I'll see you out on the flight line.